Amina slept soundly in Juma's arms, her dreams filled with images of the beautiful house, the luxurious surroundings, and the gentle touch of the man beside her. But as the night wore on, her dreams began to shift. What started as a peaceful slumber soon turned into a nightmare. In her dream, Amina was running through the village, the sky dark and stormy. She could hear her mother calling out her name, her voice full of fear and desperation. Amina tried to find her, but no matter how fast she ran, she couldn't reach her. The village seemed to stretch on forever, the familiar paths twisting and turning into a maze. The sound of her mother's voice grew louder and more frantic, echoing in Amina's mind. She felt a deep sense of dread, a fear that something terrible was about to happen. Amina suddenly woke up with a gasp, her heart pounding in her chest. She sat up in bed, her breath coming in quick, shallow bursts. For a moment, she didn't know where she was. The room was dark, and the only sound was the soft breathing of Juma beside her. But as she looked around, the events of the night came rushing back to her. The house, the dinner, the intimacy she had shared with Juma. But now, in the stillness of the night, a heavy weight settled on her chest. She remembered her mother, waiting for her at home. She had promised to be back before dark, but now it was the middle of the night. Panic gripped her as she imagined her mother, worried and alone, wondering where she had gone. Amina shook Juma gently, her voice trembling as she whispered his name. "Juma, I need to go home. I need to go now." Juma stirred, groggy from sleep, and looked at her with half-closed eyes. "What's wrong, Amina?" he asked, his voice thick with sleep. "I need to go home," she repeated, more urgently this time. "My mother, I left her alone. She'll be worried sick." Juma frowned, still trying to shake off the sleep. "It's the middle of the night, Amina. You should stay. It's not safe to go out now." But Amina was already getting out of bed, searching for her clothes in the darkness. "I have to go," she insisted, her voice rising with desperation. "I can't stay here. Please, Juma, I need to leave now." Seeing the fear in her eyes, Juma sighed and nodded. He could see she wouldn't be persuaded to stay. All right, he said, sitting up and rubbing his eyes. "I'll have my driver take you home." Amina felt a wave of relief wash over her, but it was quickly replaced by a gnawing sense of dread. She needed to get home as quickly as possible. She dressed hurriedly while Juma made a call to his driver. A few minutes later, the driver was ready, and Amina followed him out of the house, her mind racing with thoughts of her mother. Juma walked her to the car, his hand on her back, but Amina could barely focus on him. Her mind was already miles away, back in the village with her mother. "I'm sorry I can't take you myself," Juma said as she got into the car. "I have an early day tomorrow. But don't worry, the driver will make sure you get home safely." Amina nodded, barely hearing his words. She just wanted to get home. As the car pulled out of the driveway and onto the road, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The drive seemed to take forever, the darkness outside the car windows only heightening her anxiety. By the time they arrived at her home, the first light of dawn was starting to break over the horizon. Amina jumped out of the car before it had even come to a full stop and ran towards the house. But when she reached the door, she found it wide open, the house eerily quiet. Her heart sank. "Mama?" she called out, her voice trembling, but there was no answer. She ran from room to room, searching frantically, but her mother was nowhere to be found. Panic rose in her chest, her hands trembling as she tried to think of where her mother could be. Then, one of the neighbors, an elderly woman named Mama Zawadi, appeared in the doorway, her face lined with worry. "Amina, my child," she said softly, her voice filled with sorrow. "Your mother went out looking for you last night. She was so worried." Amina's heart froze. "Where is she? Where's my mother?" Mama Zawadi hesitated, her eyes full of sympathy. "There was an accident," she said quietly. "She was hit by a car while she was searching for you. They took her to the hospital." Amina felt the ground shift beneath her feet. her vision blurring as tears filled her eyes. "No, no, this can't be happening," she whispered, her voice breaking. Without waiting for another word, she turned and ran out of the house, her feet pounding against the dirt path as she headed towards the hospital. When she arrived, her heart was pounding in her chest, a mix of hope and fear driving her forward. She burst through the doors, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "My mother!" she cried, her voice frantic. "Where is she? I need to see her." A nurse hurried over, her expression grim. "What's your mother's name?" "Fatima Mwandishi," Amina replied, her voice shaking. The nurse hesitated, her eyes softening with pity. "I'm so sorry, my dear," she said gently. "Your mother, she didn't make it. She passed away shortly after arriving." Amina's world crumbled around her. She collapsed onto the floor, a wail of anguish escaping her lips. The pain was too much to bear, the guilt overwhelming her. If only she had gone home earlier, if only she hadn't stayed with Juma, maybe her mother would still be alive. She cried bitterly, her tears falling like rain, her heart breaking into a million pieces. All the luxury and beauty she had experienced that night now meant nothing. All she wanted was her mother, but it was too late. She was gone, and Amina was left with nothing but sorrow and regret. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, but the pain in Amina's heart refused to heal. Her mother's funeral had been a quiet, sorrowful affair, with only a few villagers present to pay their respects. Amina had stood by the grave, her eyes dry but her heart shattered into a million pieces. She had cried so much in the days leading up to the funeral that she felt numb, as if all her tears had dried up. But even though she couldn't cry anymore, the sorrow remained. Every morning she woke up, hoping that the nightmare would end, that she would find her mother in the kitchen, humming a tune as she prepared breakfast. But the house was empty, and the silence was deafening. Amina tried to go on with her life, but everything reminded her of her mother. Her mother's favorite chair, the garden they used to tend together, the old, worn clothes still hanging in the closet. Each memory was like a dagger to her heart, and she couldn't escape the overwhelming guilt that plagued her. If only she had gone home that night, if only she had been there, maybe her mother would still be alive. One morning, as Amina was washing clothes by the river, she felt a strange sensation in her stomach. It was a flutter, like butterflies, followed by a wave of nausea that made her gasp. She dropped the clothes she was holding and clutched her stomach, a sinking feeling of dread washing over her. As the days passed, the feeling didn't go away. Instead, it grew stronger. Her stomach began to swell slightly, and her appetite became erratic. She knew the signs, though she tried to deny them at first. But the truth was unavoidable. She was pregnant. Amina's heart broke all over again. She was carrying Juma's child, the man who had brought so much joy and pain into her life. But now, in her darkest hour, he was nowhere to be found. She couldn't remember the exact way to his house. The path seemed to blur in her memory. She had tried to find him, wandering the roads she thought led to his mansion. But each time, she ended up lost and confused. It was as if Juma had vanished, like a dream that faded with the morning light. She cried every night, feeling more alone than ever. With her mother gone, she had no one to turn to, no one to help her through this terrifying time. How would she care for a child all by herself? How would she provide for a baby when she could barely take care of herself? But despite her fears, Amina knew she couldn't give up. She remembered her mother's strength, how she had always worked hard to provide for them, no matter how difficult life became. Amina resolved to do the same. She would keep the baby, for her mother's sake, and she would find a way to survive, even if it meant working by the roadside, selling whatever she could to make a living. The months passed slowly, and Amina did what she could to prepare for the baby's arrival. She sold fruits and vegetables in the market, earning just enough to get by. The villagers, though they pitied her, could do little to help. They had their own struggles, their own burdens to carry. Amina's only solace was the small life growing inside her, a reminder that she wasn't completely alone. But just as she began to find a small measure of peace, another storm came crashing into her life. One day, as she sat in the clinic for her antenatal visit, the nurse called her name. Amina stood up, her heart pounding with nervousness. She had been feeling unwell lately, more so than she thought was normal for a pregnant woman. She hoped it was just the stress, the exhaustion from working so hard. But when she looked into the nurse's eyes, she saw something that made her blood run cold. "Amina," the nurse began, her voice gentle but serious. "We've run some tests, and I'm afraid I have some difficult news to share with you." Amina's breath caught in her throat. "What is it?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. The nurse hesitated, then spoke the words that would shatter Amina's world all over again. "You've tested positive for HIV." For a moment, Amina didn't understand. The words seemed to float in the air, distant and meaningless. But then, like a tidal wave, the reality of what the nurse had said crashed over her. HIV, the virus that would change her life forever, that would put her and her unborn baby at risk. No, this can't be true," Amina whispered, shaking her head as tears welled up in her eyes. "There must be a mistake." "I'm so sorry, Amina," the nurse said softly, her eyes filled with pity. "The test is accurate, but we'll start treatment right away to protect your baby as much as possible." Amina's hands trembled as she clutched the edge of the chair. All the pain and sorrow she had tried to bury rushed back, overwhelming her with a force she couldn't withstand. She felt like she was drowning, the weight of everything crushing her until she could hardly breathe. She cried bitterly, her sobs echoing through the small clinic room. The tears she thought had dried up returned in full force, each one a testament to the unbearable pain she carried inside her. She had lost her mother, her future, and now, even her own body had betrayed her. The world felt dark and unforgiving, and Amina couldn't see any way out of the misery that had become her life. The days following the devastating news of her HIV diagnosis were the darkest in Amina's life. She couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, and couldn't stop the flood of painful thoughts that consumed her every waking moment. The guilt, the shame, and the overwhelming sense of hopelessness were too much to bear. Every time she looked at her growing belly, she was reminded of the life inside her, a life she feared she had cursed with her mistakes. One evening, unable to endure the pain any longer, Amina made a decision that would change everything. She slipped out of the house and walked into the bush, the place where she and her mother used to gather firewood. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the ground, and the air was thick with the sounds of the night. She wandered deep into the bush, her mind numb to everything around her. She couldn't see a way out of her suffering. Her mother was gone, Juma was nowhere to be found, and she was carrying a child that might have to face the same fate as her. Despair clung to her like a heavy fog, clouding her thoughts and pushing her to the brink. As she reached a secluded spot, Amina fell to her knees, tears streaming down her face. She could barely see through the haze of her grief. She felt utterly alone, lost in a world that seemed to have abandoned her. She picked up a sharp stone, her hands trembling, and held it to her wrist. Her heart pounded in her chest, and for a moment, she hesitated, a small voice inside her begging her to stop. But the pain was too much. She couldn't live like this anymore. She closed her eyes, preparing to end it all, when suddenly, she heard a voice. "My child, what are you doing?" Amina's eyes snapped open, and she turned to see an elderly man standing a few feet away. He wore a simple robe, and in his hand he carried a Bible. His face was kind, his eyes filled with concern and understanding. The man was Pastor Peter, a well-known and respected figure in the village. He had spent the day praying in the bush, seeking guidance from God. As he was heading back home, he had stumbled upon Amina in her moment of deepest despair. "Put the stone down, my child," Pastor Peter said gently, taking a step closer. "Whatever it is that troubles you, this is not the way." Amina's hands shook as she slowly lowered the stone, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know what to say, didn't know if she could even find the words to explain the turmoil she was in. But the pastor's presence was calming, his voice like a lifeline in the storm of her emotions. I can't do this anymore," Amina whispered, her voice trembling. I've lost everything. My mother is gone. I'm alone, and I'm sick. I don't want to live like this. Pastor Peter knelt down beside her, his expression filled with compassion. I know you're hurting, Amina, he said softly, but taking your own life won't take away the pain. It will only pass that pain on to others who love you, even those you've yet to meet. Amina shook her head, tears streaming down her face. But I have nothing left, she sobbed. No one cares about me. I'm just a burden. The pastor placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. You're not alone, Amina. God sees your pain and He has a plan for you even if you can't see it now. Your life is precious, and so is the life of the child you're carrying. There is hope, even in the darkest of times. Amina looked into Pastor Peter's eyes, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, she saw a glimmer of hope. It was faint, like a tiny light at the end of a long tunnel, but it was enough to make her pause, to reconsider her decision. Come with me, Pastor Peter said, helping her to her feet. Let's go back to the village. We'll get you the help you need. You don't have to go through this alone. With his gentle guidance, Amina allowed herself to be led back to the village. Over the next few weeks, the pastor and the church community wrapped her in their care, providing counseling, support, and a listening ear whenever she needed it. Through their love and encouragement, Amina began to heal, slowly but surely. She started taking her HIV treatment regularly, determined to protect her unborn child. Months later, Amina gave birth to a beautiful baby girl. The joy she felt when she heard her daughter's first cry was overwhelming, a wave of pure love and gratitude that washed away the darkness that had once consumed her. The doctors confirmed that her baby was HIV negative, a miracle that brought Amina to tears. She named her daughter Fatima, after her beloved mother, vowing to raise her with all the love and care that she had once received. As Fatima grew, Amina dedicated herself to teaching her daughter the values she had learned through her own struggles: strength, resilience, and the importance of making wise choices. She wanted to ensure that Fatima would never have to endure the same pain she had faced, that she would grow up strong, confident, and loved. Amina also began to share her story with others, especially the young people in the village. She spoke at churches, schools, and community gatherings, using her own experiences to warn them of the dangers of making hasty decisions and to encourage them to seek help when they were struggling. Her story became a beacon of hope for many, a testament to the power of faith, resilience, and the love of a caring community. Through the support of the church and the strength she found within herself, Amina was able to rebuild her life. She watched her daughter grow, her heart swelling with pride and love every time Fatima smiled up at her. And in those moments, Amina knew that, despite all the pain she had endured, she had found her purpose: to protect, love, and guide her daughter, and to use her own story to make a difference in the lives of others.